Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. Picture this, a serene Instagram reel. A woman bakes sourdough bread in a sun-drenched kitchen. Her linen dress flows as she pulls the loaf from the oven, perfectly golden. Her kids play quietly nearby, building something out of wooden blocks. The captions are filled with words like clean, grounded, natural, intentional. You can practically smell the rosemary and hear the chicken coop out back. It looks peaceful, wholesome, even radical in an anti-consumerist, back to the land, opt out of the matrix kind of way. But keep scrolling. Soon you're seeing hashtags like tradwife, homestead life, God made me a female. You stumble into videos talking about rejecting modern womanhood, homeschooling to protect kids from woke agendas, and questioning whether democracy ever really worked in the first place. It can feel like you blinked and suddenly the sourdough turned into something much darker. How did we get here? These aesthetic movements, homesteading, natural health, herbal remedies, crunchy mom culture, are exploding online. And at first glance, many of them feel like they could be part of a modern, eco-conscious, even progressive lifestyle. But in the corners of social media, that same imagery is being used to recruit for something very different. This is where the lines blur between wellness and ideology, between lifestyle and politics. And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today we're digging into how these overlapping subcultures, mysticism, environmentalism, motherhood, and wellness, have become fertile ground for the far right. How identity algorithms and the longing for simplicity collide in unexpected ways. To help us navigate all this, we're grounding our conversation in the personal story of Kavisha Pillay, who wrote the article, How Algorithms Tried to Turn Me into a Tradwife. She offers a first-hand look at what it feels like to be drawn in by this world, where it starts and where it can lead. And we'll layer in insight from Catherine Rottenberg, a scholar who studies neoliberal feminism and has explored the cultural currents shaping this moment. Catherine Rottenberg helps us understand the bigger picture, why this aesthetic appeals, what anxieties it taps into, and how, despite its nostalgic charm, the tradwife movement ultimately reinforces regressive gender norms by repackaging submission and domesticity as empowering lifestyle choices. So how does it happen? How does someone go from buying organic baby food and essential oils to sharing conspiracy theories about globalist agendas? From linen dresses and natural birth blogs to promoting traditional gender roles and warning about the collapse of Western civilization. This shift from crunchy to conspiratorial, from holistic to hardline, is what some have started calling the crunchy to radical pipeline. It's subtle. It doesn't come at you like a political ad. It comes through a post about herbal remedies, or a YouTuber showing you how to make DIY cleaning supplies, who then casually mentions toxins in vaccines or throws in a warning about woke indoctrination. And what starts as a lifestyle choice, wanting to live off the grid or raise your kids away from the system, can morph into something else entirely. And it's not just happening in parenting forums or cottagecore corners. The same aesthetic and emotional language runs through the wellness industry, where distrust of big pharma bleeds into anti-vaccine rhetoric. It shows up in the anti-expert movement, where intuition is elevated over science and personal truth trumps collective knowledge. Here's biomedical scientist Dr. Andrea Love.
You have this kind of ecosystem where now it's the wellness industry and all these podcasters who are telling you the truth that the scientists and the doctors and the government are hiding from you. And that has led to the explosion of kind of this alt-right wellness industry. And this has kind of converged with the growth of increasing health anxiety as a result of the COVID pandemic, where people, they're looking for voices who are going to tell them the quick fixes to take control of their health.
And writer Derek Beres.
There has been a long-standing conservative anti-intellectual movement in America, but that's become a real anti-expert movement. And that is partly driven by the fact that wellness influencers, you're looking at Gwyneth Paltrow selling supplements, and people on the right, Alex Jones selling supplements, they have a vested interest in saying that doctors don't know what they're talking about. You should do this for your health.
These overlapping narratives create an ecosystem where questioning modernity becomes a moral imperative and rejecting authority becomes a badge of authenticity. Here's Kavisha Pillay.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look at how these issues, which I think started off as fairly separate movements in themselves. So perhaps the tradwives were sitting somewhere and the homesteaders were somewhere else and the homeschoolers were elsewhere. And they may have intersected here and there, but they were fairly separate. I think the thing that brought all of these movements together into the same space, and then we started to see it snowball from there and go viral, and people getting co-opted into the movements, was actually the pandemic. And why I'm saying this is that the pandemic was just, there's still so much of research that needs to happen in terms of what happened to us psychologically, where you take people and you lock them down into their homes, and there's now this virus, which is really scary, and your pre-existing fears and biases and stereotypes start to play up. And all of a sudden, the only place that we can meet each other is online. And with algorithms in social media, you are then being placed into various interesting echo chambers. And then from there, starting to fall really deep into some of these rabbit holes. So, for example, with the homeschooling, I remember this of, kids who were homeschooled were kind of on the outside. It wasn't a norm. But during the pandemic, there was no option. You had to homeschool your kids. So kids were learning online and parents were playing much more of a role. But during that time, there were also, in America, for example, there was a lot of the conversations around critical race theory. And what are you teaching kids about inclusion, inclusivity, and LGBTQ rights started to come up. And these were polarizing issues. We don't want our children to know about this. We don't want this type of history to be taught. And lockdowns and homeschooling your kids during that time then provided perhaps some people with this opportunity to say, actually, well, if we don't like the public school system because they're corrupt and, we don't agree with their political ideologies and so on, why not just keep our kids here and we'll teach them at home, and we can teach them and provide them with content that we as parents feel comfortable with. I think similar with the homesteading. So homesteading was potentially something that was, coming from the eco groups who were, sort of producing content about why you need to be living off the ground or why organic food matters. Big food is potentially, not potentially, but big food is quite dangerous. And this is just a healthier alternative. And then you also perhaps had the tradwife movement, who, again, sort of small group, just a few people, perhaps a little bit conservative in their ideologies to some extent, speaking about the importance of being a homemaker and having a traditional lifestyle with traditional gender roles. And put all of this together during the pandemic, where this content starts to intersect with each other. I think then it starts to triangulate, and you're starting to see why it's become so popular, but also why it's become so radicalized in some ways. And, throw in the manosphere and the anti-vax movements and so on, and I think you're sitting on something that's quite dangerous. But that's not to say that all homesteaders are anti-vaxxers, or all tradwives are homeschooling their children. So you could have your various reasons for why you're homesteading, or why you're tradwifing, or why you're homeschooling your children. But then I think where there are the sects in the sort of digital space, where those reasons for doing that starts to intersect and then becomes quite dangerous because it's filled with conspiracy theories, it's filled with fears, it's sort of radicalizing people in different ways. So I think the pandemic may have been this convergence point where all of these different conspiracies, all of these different fringe movements start to intersect, and then they've become something that I don't even know if we have a handle on the impact that it's having and how it's shaping behaviors and ideas.
So how do we make sense of a movement that blends distrust of institutions, a yearning for tradition, and the tools of influencer capitalism? As Kavisha notes, it's not that these ideas were new, but the pandemic acted as an accelerant, fusing them together through the pressure cooker of isolation, fear, and algorithmically amplified content. And even when some of these groups seem to resist modern systems, rejecting mainstream feminism, for instance, they still operate within these very structures. As Catherine Rottenberg explains, the tradwife aesthetic may look like a rejection of modernity, but is deeply entangled with it.
Even as tradwives sort of disavow neoliberalism and feminism, they're both the products of it. So, they in many ways are ideal neoliberal subjects. They're entrepreneurial, right? They're monetizing their brand. So I think we also need to understand the phenomenon as embedded in and inextricable from neoliberalism. And also it is, again, as we talked about before, indebted to feminism. So even being pitted against feminism, it needs something that it can counter. And feminism becomes the object of its enmity, although not for all tradwives. And again, tradwives, and these movements, it's a wide umbrella. It's a large umbrella. So even as most of them are yearning for or promoting gender traditionalism.
What makes this pipeline so confounding is how hard it is to label. It defies easy binaries like left or right, progressive or conservative. That slipperiness, the inability to categorize it neatly, isn't just a quirk. It's central to the appeal.
The inability to kind of capture or to try and give an account that feels satisfying is part of the phenomenon. I've been asked about particularly tradwives for the past 5 years, I think. So lots in the wake of the publication of my book, the Rise of Neoliberal Feminism, and then sort of the very early media coverage of tradwives there was a lot of coverage that sort of pitted tradwives versus feminism. And my colleague at LSE, Professor Shania Orgad, and I, we actually began to think about it in relation to the kind of popular neoliberal feminism that both of us had been writing about. And at the time, 5 years ago, it's like, this is a marginal phenomenon. I'm not going to spend a lot of, air talking about it. And what we've seen in the past 5 years is really the mainstreaming of a lot of these ideas. And I agree with you that it's often difficult to sort of pigeonhole some of these influencers, or some of the different ways in which sort of tradwivery appears in the media as either left or right. So I think that you're I hear you in terms of your fascination and sort of this. It's puzzling as a phenomenon.
The result? A strange brew of ideologies that don't look like the old left-right divide. Instead, it's yoga moms watching Jordan Peterson, it's flat earth Facebook groups filled with birth doulas, it's organic channels recommending ivermectin. It's not about left or right, it's about vibe. And that vibe is about rejecting modernity, trusting nature, and taking control of your life. So when someone like Kavisha logs into TikTok or Instagram, the algorithm doesn't just see her interest in gut health or vintage homemaking, it sees a pathway to more content. More aesthetically pleasing, more emotionally resonant, and identity shaping. And it often ends up reinforcing a very specific narrative, that the modern world is broken and that salvation lies in going back. So if this convergence of gentle living and radical ideology seems puzzling, it is. But it's not just random. There are deeper forces at play here. Technology, emotion, history, ideology, all blending in very personal ways.
Well, it started because I was interested in homesteading, and I was interested in growing my own vegetables because I think that sort of consuming organic produce is healthier. So that's where my entry point came into it. And I remember during the pandemic, everybody had all of this time to bake their own bread and really invest time in cooking and doing all, and that sort of shaped us, perhaps in a positive way as well, because prior to that, you're consuming a lot of fast food, things that aren't that great, and that shift in spending more time at home and being able to have a bit more of a balance, perhaps where you are, able to cook and do all of this was, in my case, I felt was a healthier move for me. But what I started to see online, and it was so subtle, was just that it started with because I was interested in terms of how do I grow my own vegetables. And I have a very tiny garden. I live in the city, so I have a very tiny garden, but I wanted to know with my tiny garden, how can I grow different things? And then it sort of takes you down into, preparing food. And then it will sort of take you down into maintaining a household. And then it goes a little bit further, and it's about how you should be more feminine. And I think for me, the sort of issues that it was bringing up for me was that I'm sort of for my entire working life, just sort of caught up in that girl boss culture. So you worked and you did the meetings and you went to, you focused on a career. And that was also very much coming from my own background, where my mom and my grandma never had those opportunities. So I'm the first in the line that actually gets to focus on a career, and being the trad wife wasn't a requirement for me as it was for previous generations, but also for some members of my community. So it was interesting how that all of the content that I was starting to consume was making me feel that what I was doing was wrong because I wasn't feminine enough. So I wasn't wearing the flowy dresses, and I was always felt stressed out. And maybe if I just sort of spend some time barefoot in my garden and baking some bread, I wouldn't feel the sort of constant angst that I felt. And I started to grapple with that quite a bit about, did I make the right choices? What am I doing with my life? I'm constantly in this rat race. I want to move out of Johannesburg. I want to live on a farm, that type of thing. And this was like a really sort of a very present thought in my head. And I think it was only after I started to do some reading into the tradwife movement, because I've never actually come across that content, and nobody in my friend circle was talking about this stuff. And it was only after I started doing some reading and researching that I realized, hey, wait, this is, there's something more insidious behind this. It's not just about, living in a calmer life and, having goats and being in flowy dresses. There's a whole political ideology that is driving some of this content targeted towards women about, what is your gender roles. But also what I found really interesting was that actually there were some studies that were suggesting that whilst you think that the content is actually for women, a lot of it is directed at men. And there was, I think in the New York Times, there was an article about some research around pornographic sites and how women who were cosplaying as tradwives was a really popular trend there. So then it started to make me think, well, I know that on social media, you are being purposefully targeted with certain types of information. I always just assumed that, it had to do with politics. So, who you're going to vote for, who you're not going to vote for, what you're going to believe and so on. I never actually realized that, and I don't know why, but I never actually realized that even on these things around homesteading or these issues around baking bread and caring for kids and like homemaking actually will have actors behind it that may be wanting to push particular narratives in order to influence behavior. So when I eventually emerged from my rabbit hole and I started to write about it, everybody found it quite amusing because I sort of work on algorithmic accountability issues and digital literacy and critical thinking. There was just a sort of running joke in my circles that, oh, you even got duped. And that's the point, is that you could be a critical thinker and you could understand how the algorithms work, but you could be so subtly influenced and pulled into different rabbit holes because it appeals to biases, it appeals to certain ideas that you have or who you want to be. And I think that's why this, the sort of trip down into the tradwife rabbit hole was a good one for me because it just, one, I think, made me a bit more aware of the types of content. And even if I see something that seems benign, you just have to engage with it a bit more critically about, ways that potentially going to take you in, who's driving this, and why am I seeing so much of this content?
Kavisha Pillay knew how algorithms worked. She studies them. But even she felt the pull, a soft nudge toward an old story wrapped in aesthetic appeal. These technologies don't act in a vacuum. They tap into deeper frustrations, unresolved pressures, and shifting ideals. To really understand why traditional gender roles and nostalgic visions of the past are resonating again, we need to look at what people are navigating underneath the surface.
So I think it's really interesting because I do think that social media and algorithmic logic plays a role here. But I think social media is only part of the larger puzzle about why we're seeing sort of the attraction to this tradwives. And again, this is part of what I've been thinking about. I don't have a great answer, but I think that we have to think in terms of the larger context. And I think some of the things that in the article that I read after you had sent it to me, it resonates with a lot of the things, as you pointed out before. If you read some of the tradwife posts, if you read some of the articles or the influencers' posts, what you see is a kind of there are many factors that are going into the appeal, and some of them have to do with, as I would claim, sort of the impossibility that neoliberal feminism or popular feminism presents of a happy work family ideal. Even for the most privileged women, it becomes impossible in a world in which precarity, whether we're talking about work or we're talking about other aspects of our lives, like gig economy, it becomes increasingly difficult to even imagine the possibility of having a happy work family balance. And that's accompanied by those of us who are in stable jobs, the always on toxic work culture. And a lot of the tradwives, at least the ones that I've looked at, do talk about, the rat race was becoming unbearable and they just wanted to ramp off. And again, so instead of seeing it as sort of, you need to understand it in those terms. So toxic work culture, we have the increasing precarity. We also have the fruits of feminism, so that women actually are able to, in some sense, choose, even if those choices are extremely circumscribed. And there's also the sense that the world is, there's so many existential threats at the moment to human life on this planet that I think a nostalgia for what would you say, a simpler past where we all know our roles. Somehow I can kind of see that appeal, but I think it's in that context that we have to understand sort of the fascination that we all seem to, but some of us have with this phenomenon, and social media, of course, does play a role, and you can go down a rabbit hole. And we see that also, recently there's been a lot of stuff in the press around adolescence. Has that come? The TV series and about toxic masculinity and the whole phenomenon of Andrew Tate. So I think these can be seen as sort of not parallel, you can't reduce one to another, but sort of thinking through why sort of gender traditionalism has a renewed appeal for a generation that has been exposed to and has often embraced feminism.
To unpack that tension further, we turn to a concept Rottenberg has explored extensively: neoliberal feminism. Women were told they could have it all: career, family, balance, if they just leaned in.
Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, very, very sort of talked about article why women still can't have it all in the Atlantic. So that's the moment that I identify as the sort of the emergence of a new kind or variant of feminism. And it's a feminism that does acknowledge gender inequality, but the solutions that it posits are individual and, it evacuates sort of terms like social justice or liberation. And instead, what we hear more and more is a happy work-family balance and happiness and lean in. So it's this very interesting and, for me as a feminist, disturbing phenomenon. And what happens is increasingly feminism becomes a term because it has basically evacuated most of those terms that traditionally have been associated with even liberal feminism, and replaced them with sort of more palatable terms like happiness or, a happy work-family balance, and really individualized and responsibilized, meaning that the responsibility for solving gender inequalities is down to the individual woman, right? So lean in is about leaning into your career in order to to address gender inequality in the workplace. The ideal was a happy work-family balance, right? And that for me was interesting, and also unlike anything that I'd ever heard was the ideal for feminism, right? So so that's sort of neoliberal feminism in a convoluted definition. But what we also saw was the embrace of a kind of neoliberal or popular feminism within the mainstream and popular press. So, whereas in 2010 or in the 2000s, there was a rejection of feminism, and sort of to identify as a feminist meant that you were on the radical left and so on and so forth. What you saw following the Sheryl Sandberg and others coming out, if you will, as feminist was the increasing embrace of the feminist rubric or the identification, with Beyonce and so forth. And so for me, as a scholar of feminist theory and of feminism, it was really interesting in trying to give an account of why we saw this, and sort of the reasons for. So neoliberal feminism actually is a convergence of neoliberalism, which I understand not just as an economic agenda, but also as a political rationality, meaning that it also shapes us as individuals and recasts us or sort of converts us into specks of human capital. So when we talk about, we see this, I work in the university, we see this in sort of the leadership of our presidents, or they become CEOs, right? And students become consumers. And that's all part of what is called the neoliberalization of higher education, where education is no longer seen as a good in and of itself, but rather as investment in oneself in order to accrue returns in the future. And so it's thinking within this kind of neoliberal logic and feminism together. And that's sort of how I came up with this term. I mean, I'm one of many who's been using and trying to understand how neoliberalism and feminism converge.
At the heart of these dynamics, whether it's the appeal of traditionalism or the disillusionment with modern feminism, is something even more primal: fear. Fear about the future, fear about our place in the world, and fear, when exploited by powerful interests, becomes a potent tool, not just for division, but for control.
We have a lot of fear, and there are people who know how to manipulate those fears. And this leads to increased polarization, because I find that, the irony of all of this is that the tech bros who created these sites say that it was to connect people. And somehow we are so divided, because we can barely have conversations with each other on difficult issues. So fear, I think, plays a big part in this. The fact that that there's so little trust in journalism, in the media, and that's not to say that the mainstream media is not also responsible for the state of distrust because of their own polarization that they've caused. But the fact, the environment that we're in is that if I don't like what you're saying on your show, I can go and find somebody who would tick all of my boxes and agree with all of my biases and would confirm every belief that I have. And then I will stay with those people because that's where I feel seen and validated and heard. And the sort of information ecosystem is so fragmented that the things and the information that I consume can be so different to the next person. And the sort of basis of our shared reality at some point is called into question. So I've just published a sort of article today on a local media site about the story of Henny Penny. I don't know if you know this, but Henny Penny is a fable. It's a children's story, and they did a movie called Chicken Little at some point in the early 2000s. And the story is based on, so Henny Penny is this chicken, and she is plucking under a tree, and an acorn falls on her head, and she's convinced the sky is falling. So very, in a panic, and gets all of her friends and Ducky Lucky and Goosey Lucy, and they all have to go and tell the king, and everybody's really worried about this. But then on the way they meet Foxy Loxy, and he's very conniving, and he just like, absolutely not, the sky is not falling. And he sort of convinces them to come into his den, and he eats them all. So it's a very morbid children's story, but it is this. I think we are in an age of a modern day Henny Penny, where these acorns of misinformation, be it about the climate crisis, about immigration, about vaccines, about crime, about economic instability, whatever it may be, it's causing this panic and fear. And then we go to the Foxy Loxies of our time because we think that they're our saviors. We think that they're the ones that's going to help us deal with this issue and stop the sky from falling, and they end up eating us. So morbid. But I think this is the sort of pattern that we're seeing, is that people who have no interest potentially in actually trying to solve the problems and solve the fears. In fact, they throw these acorns of misinformation, they exacerbate the fears. They bring people into their dens and then actually have no interest in helping them. And it then sort of creates more disillusionment and more angst amongst us as a society. So fear is, the economy of the day, unfortunately. And if you know how to play to people's fears, regardless of the economic state, that's why you'd find, all across the world, working class people voting for the billionaires. Doesn't make sense, but they know how to play to the fears. They know how to make you feel anxious and upset towards, somebody else who has nothing to pretend, nothing, doesn't really have an impact on what your current day reality is.
That fear often takes the shape of nostalgia, a longing for a world that felt simpler, even if it wasn't truly better for everyone.
I think it is a sort of pushback against modern life, because all of a sudden, for example, just going back to men and young men, there was a time where the world was designed for men. It was your playing field. And now you're having to be in workplaces with different genders, different sexual identities. We're in the same space. We need to be treated as equals. And so this oyster that was yours at some point is no longer there. So there's a fear, there's a precariousness and uncertainty. So let's go back to a time when that wasn't there, because this was meant to be ours. And I think you find that in relation to immigration as well, but why we've demonized migrants in the way that we have, and various other issues around sexual identity too. So this is too scary. We don't want to see this. So let's just go back to a time when it was just us and we were okay. It's sort of dreams that we were sold, back in the heyday, when the golden age, when life was good, and we could survive off a sort of single salary and have 5 children, and we could still go on 3 holidays a year. And it was only for some people. It wasn't for all people.
And into that emotional space, algorithms drop new ideas, conspiracy theories, culture war talking points, a sense of us versus them.
I don't think most people go out seeking this content. I think you're pulled into it and influenced into it in a particular way. And part of why I started my organization was very close family members of mine who were always, on the progressive side of life, during the pandemic as well, had started to consume content, do yoga. So they were watching YouTube videos about yoga and the exercises that you're doing in lockdown, and then doing some meditations. But then the YouTube algorithm radicalized them to the point where they're completely Islamophobic. So they were consuming content that was about yoga, consuming some sort of Hindu-related content in terms of mantras and meditations. And that algorithm took them down to this point where they are fully in support of Narendra Modi and the BJP, think that all of his policies are absolutely okay, and that Muslim people in India are trying to just take over and they're bad. And this was it wasn't a sort of immediate thing. These were views that they never had before, but fairly elderly people who wouldn't necessarily, I would say, have the digital literacy skills that some people have in terms of knowing why you're being targeted, why you're seeing this information, but just constantly being hit with this, and got to this point where they found themselves in a really radicalized space. And I sort of assumed that, I knew that this could happen in terms of the political spectrum, that something as benign as yoga, which is meant to calm you down and, make you all zen and chi and whatever it may be, got them into being hardcore fundamentalists on some issues. And similarly with this, is that you could just be, searching for activities in terms of how to help your children at home with their current homework, or you could be searching for recipes, or with men, I think in particular, being pulled into this the sort of manosphere as well, which is quite radicalized in its own sense, just looking for, like, how can I be a provider? It could be something simple as that. And then if you aren't aware, you can then just go down into really dark places, which then reshapes your behavior, not just on the online world, but also in the actual real world, but how you relate to each other, how you interact with other people, and so on.
And that slide isn't happening in a vacuum. Consider the MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again. It sounds good. Who doesn't want a healthy America? But what it really signals is something deeper, the full fusion of alternative health, conspiratorial thinking, and populist politics. MAHA manages to tap into all of these anxieties at once, targeting moms worried about toxins, wellness advocates suspicious of pharma, and skeptics of government authority.
When RFK Jr. was running for president, one of the things that Kennedy did really well is picking off fringe groups. He was going to regenerative agriculture conferences. He was going to crypto conferences. He is known as an environmental champion, although if you look back at that track record, there's a lot we can pick apart from that as well. What he did was he took all of these fringe groups and he kind of brought them together under his larger brand. People within the system know it's broken and know the problems with it. But what MAHA has been able to do is exploit that gap in knowledge and just paint them with a broad brush. And unfortunately, because so many people suffer under capitalistic healthcare, they feel that sort of pain that they might have experienced. And it's very easy to indoctrinate people into your group or your mindset when people have that distrust.
The on-ramps, they all pick at these individual ideologies that resonate with these different factions of people, right? So you're targeting parents and you're saying, oh, well, the water is toxic, the food is toxic, the vaccines are toxic. Well, parents are going to resonate with that because they want to do what's best for their kids. What they're not told is that RFK Jr. is spreading misinformation about modern farming tools like GMOs. He's the one that actually was one of the leading litigators making the false claims that glyphosate causes cancer, which has now been picked up by Moms Across America, by the Environmental Working Group, by Vani Hari, by all of these other activists that now tout that.
This isn't politics in the traditional sense. It's emotional marketing, identity curation, and it thrives on distrust. In other words, what starts with sourdough bread can end with authoritarian politics. And if we're not paying attention to the emotional and systemic pathways, we'll miss how the pipeline really works. We've traveled from crunchy lifestyle choices to algorithmic rabbit holes, from the desire for meaning and simplicity to radical ideologies hiding in plain sight. But none of this is accidental.
And I think because we are just consuming outrageous content day in and day out, we've become so desensitized. So when you have the Andrew Tates and when you have the others posting really horrendous things, I can't do anything about it. It is what it is type of thing. But then similarly with this type of content, it's also, if you want to do that, you do you. If that's what makes you happy, I'm not going to say anything about it. But I think my point in terms of the article that I wrote about the tradwives is that if you willingly went into it, and you're not being co-opted or you're not being forced, and this is the life that you want to live, absolutely fine. You should have the freedom to do so. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're being sort of micro-influenced through an algorithm, or if you're being micro-targeted because you're being hit with ads or you're being hit with content and you don't actually know this, and all of a sudden you're rethinking your role as a woman in society, in your home, and so on. I think that's dangerous, and I think that's where it's not okay, because this is how you influence people to the point where they're shifting their actual behaviors and their beliefs. So the only way around this, I would say, is that if we had better transparency around the content recommendation systems on social media, why am I seeing certain content? And, why am I being targeted with certain types of information? I think if we knew this, perhaps that would, give us a bit of an arsenal to potentially fight back and push back on some of the things that we're seeing. But the absence of this and the opaqueness around algorithms means that we don't actually know why we're being targeted with certain information and content.
It's not just the existence of traditional gender roles per se, but the stealthy, manipulative ways influencers and algorithms can normalize and glamorize them, without our conscious awareness. It's a quiet erosion of agency, cloaked in the language of empowerment and choice. And it doesn't happen in a vacuum. These trends are often mirrored and reinforced by broader cultural currents, some of them deeply toxic.
The Andrew Tates of the world, sort of this really violent, toxic masculinity, and the role that social media plays, right? And then you see it kind of mirrored, but not exactly, because there are other ways in which it's operated as kind of femcel, so that, the manosphere and all of these incels and really vitriolic, misogynist content. You see some of you don't. So the tradwives and their ilk are not precisely the mirror image, but they're holding up an ideal, a kind of femininity that does seem to go hand in hand with a certain kind of idealized, masculinity, traditional masculinity. So women are submissive, women are at home, all of these things. The man is the breadwinner, so on and so forth. Again, it comes back to this yearning or encouragement to go back to a certain kind of gender division of labor that that existed, but never in the ways in which it is idealized and nostalgicized. That's a word.
So what do we do with all this? These movements, homesteading, homeschooling, tradwife, aren't inherently harmful. They can reflect valid desires for autonomy, for meaning, for community, for something that feels more grounded in an overwhelming world. But when these desires are exploited, especially through algorithmic targeting, they can become a gateway, not just to outdated gender roles, but to full-blown misogyny. A vision of womanhood defined by submission. A culture where control is rebranded as empowerment. And that's the real danger. Not that people are choosing to grow their own food or raise their kids differently, but that behind some of these choices, a darker story is being told. One that dismisses women's autonomy, reinforces toxic masculinity, and fuels mistrust in democratic institutions.
I'm still trying to figure out how to, live more quietly whilst having 1,000 devices in my house that are constantly pinging me and trying to grab my attention. Um, and how to have a more balanced life when, you're basically these days, because of hybrid working situations, you're on, like, you can work 24 hours and not stop. And I don't know if, yeah, I would say, at least from my perspective, I don't know if I have the tips and the tools, because I think it's, everybody's situation and context is so different. But what I would say is that we have to become much more aware of how our digital tools and devices influence our behavior, and how important it is to take a break from them and to switch off, and to not constantly be looking for something online. It's just so that you can feed your need for outrage, and to sort of feed your need for drama, and how it's important to actually spend time in the natural world, because I think that is potentially the balance of, like, real conversations with real people in authentic spaces, not sort of 146 characters or whatever it may be, or screaming at somebody, behind your device, and not actually trying to listen and understand and find nuance and context. And I think having more of those interactions, but also, like, having those types of interactions with people who don't always think like you, who may come from different political backgrounds and a different spectrum, and just trying to find commonality and understanding with each other. We don't have to agree on everything, but, okay, let's just have this conversation, and debate, and, have ideas and so on. So I think that's going back to, I think, taking breaks from digital spaces, going back into having natural conversations with real human beings, in natural spaces, may also temper some of the outrage that we experience online, and also the outrage that we contribute towards. We're so overstimulated. And if you don't sort of catch my attention at in a 30-second reel, sometimes I find that, like, in the same way that you swipe on reels or things that you don't, it's like, okay, next.
Right.
The 30 seconds, I didn't find that interesting. Moving on. So I think we're also forgetting to just engage with people and to just be patient.
So, as we engage with these trends, the task isn't to mock or dismiss them, it's to understand them, to recognize where empowerment ends and control begins, and to meet that longing for meaning with something more honest, more just, and more inclusive. It's tempting to see this as a clear divide: tradwives versus feminists, left versus right, bread baking versus boss babe. But real life isn't that clean.
So my mom always makes this joke that I used to dress like a teenage boy. So jeans and sneakers and t-shirts were my go-to uniform. And all of a sudden, I found that I was in flowy dresses. And so that happened. And I was shifting my thinking around. I mean, I was doing a lot of my garden is thriving, by the way. So I'm very grateful to the influencers who provided good tips and tricks on how to have a growing city garden. But I think it's made me feel like there are some middle grounds to this. And in a polarized society, we don't like this, because you have to pick a side. You're
Right.
either sort of feminist or you're a tradwife, and you can't be in between. And my feeling is that I am a modern woman. I am going to work. I do want to have an organic garden. I am going to dress a little bit more flowy. That's okay. That's really fine. I don't think that's an issue. I think where you pull into that extreme, where you have to sort of embody these gender norms and these gender stereotypes, that you have to be submissive, that you have to go back a la 1950s housewives. I think that's problematic, because it is dangerous in the sense of the women's rights movement has done so much in terms of fighting for equality, fighting for access to the workplace, better pay. And what this type of content does is that it takes young women to a point where actually none of that matters, because you don't need to be a man. You just need to be at home, and you just need to know your place. And that's where this becomes really dangerous.
The problem isn't the homesteading, the baking, or the dresses. It's when these personal preferences get swept into a political movement, one that uses aesthetic comfort to sell regressive ideals. This isn't just about content, it's about context. What stories are being told underneath the sourdough? And whose future are they quietly shaping? I want to thank Kavisha Pillay and Catherine Rottenberg. Kavisha Pillay is Executive Director of the Campaign on Digital Ethics, CODE. You can learn more at code-sa.org. Catherine Rottenberg is Professor in the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London, where she studies the convergence of feminism and neoliberalism, as well as the politics of care. That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Want to dive deeper? Check out my Substack at outrageoverload.substack.com or outrageoverload.net/newsletter for more insights beyond the podcast. Subscribe, comment, and join the conversation. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.